All right, now for something completely different. I will just say quickly thank you very much to Andy for the lovely introduction, and also thank you to the organizers for inviting me here for a colloquium on early African history, despite the fact that I am in no way a historian of early Africa. But I hope you will forgive me as I try to sort of make some connections. Given the time, I'm just going to go ahead with it, and hopefully we'll sort of catch up. Okay. So in 1884, Taka Jairam Narayanji traveled from Bombay to Zanzibar to take up a commission contract with one of the most powerful mercantile houses in East Africa. Jairam was one of hundreds of young men from Western India, primarily from the princely states of Kutch and Kathiawar, who traversed the Indian Ocean to try their luck in the booming commercial economy of East Africa. Under the usual circumstances, we would only know of Jairam's existence if his boss became wary of their relationship and registered the original contract or a reworking of it at the British consulate in Zanzibar. Documents such as these, and this is not Jairam's document, but an example of one, of which thousands survive in the colonial records housed at the Zanzibar National Archives, were Kutchi Gujarati contracts with a long history that were translated both to fit the East African context and the expectations of an expanding Anglo-Indian legal regime. As luck would have it, however, Jairam recorded his experiences in a text that would become the earliest known published work on Africa in Gujarati. Jairam's book, entitled Jangba Bhatia Pravas, or The Bhatias of Zanzibar, reads less like a travelogue and more like a rather pugnacious treatise on the benefits and pitfalls of travel, directed specifically at his fellow Bhatia brothers. And here we can sort of simply define the Bhatias as a caste-cum community found in this area up here of northwestern India. Interestingly, a full 43 pages of his strongest criticisms are reserved for those many Bhatias in the practice of, quote, keeping African women, termed habsan, and committing adultery with them. And so I'm going to be referring to Africans and African women in this paper, and it's a little too simplistic, of course, but Jairam is particularly interested in the Marima coast, which you can see highlighted up here. So Jairam covers a variety of disadvantages, from the financial costs of keeping African women, both for the merchant and his family back home, to the negative effects on their spiritual and physical health. Countering Jairam's incendiary and often outright racist descriptions, however, the text includes conversations, remembered, imagined, or both, with East African Bhatias that provide various material and intimate justifications for those relations. Now, it would be quite simple to analyze this text as a source for the history of South Asian diasporas in the modern Indian Ocean. One may, for example, posit a conflict between the moral and financial economies of home and diaspora, as I have suggested elsewhere. The text also employs many of the racial tropes of darkest Africa present in later travelogues and novels, and Jairam's text certainly fits within the emerging modern print cultures of the 19th century Indian Ocean. Indeed, the argumentative style of the piece echoes the published essays and pamphlets of mid-19th century Indian reform movements, which were arguably instrumental in the making of the modern Gujarati language and culture itself. So I'm actually using the term Gujarati here, but that, as well as African, is also a problematic category to use. Today, however, I want to approach this text and a larger body of neglected 19th century Gujarati documents in a somewhat different way, as a source for early, or at least early-ish, socioeconomic histories of Indian Ocean East Africa. So scholars of early East African history, of course, are no strangers to using non-European written sources, particularly those in Arabic and Ajami script, and to exploring the cosmopolitan and Creole social worlds that these documents imply. South Asian language documents, however, are rarely considered among these sources. This is in part because many come from the late 19th and 20th centuries, when Gujarati merchants increasingly relied on British imperial transportation, communication, and legal infrastructures, and British colonial desires for cheap labor produced a sizable and more diverse Indian diaspora of indentured migrants. As hinted at earlier, my archive of Gujarati sources is in fact decidedly 19th century and largely framed by, if not deeply embedded in, the colonial archive. And so, as I sort of confessed earlier, I have some ambivalence towards defining myself as a historian of early African history. Nevertheless, the Gujarati connection with coastal East Africa goes back to at least the 16th century, if not much before, and though actors like Jairam were part of networks that entered Indian Ocean commerce at the turn of the 19th century, they were a part of a connected Kutchi-Kathiawari region that had participated in Indian Ocean commerce for much longer. If Jairam's account reveals what N. Seng Ho has described as the, quote, intimate, sticky, and prolonged relations entered into by migrant traders, then the Creole lexicons of 19th century Gujarati commercial documents, such as the one featured here, illuminate the consequences, both social and conceptual, of these prolonged intimate and economic associations. In employing the concept of Creolite, I'm writing against the area studies and trading diaspora models that have also contributed to the neglect of South Asian sources for African history. So despite excellent scholarship on the Afrabian social spaces of East Africa, South Asians continue to be conceived of as a community of outsiders. On the one hand, we see an adoption of reified racial and ethnic categories produced by both colonial actors and by subcontinental reformers who, from the late 19th century, were actively producing the Indian diaspora. On the other, it is the legacy of the extensive scholarship on cross-cultural exchange in which trust or social capital is essential and produced through closed networks, whether bounded by kinship, faith, or both. More recent scholarship has shifted focus to the regulatory institutions and instruments of Islamic law, and East Africa was certainly a part of a larger Islamic space. The Gujarati documents registered in Zanzibar are significantly outnumbered by Arabic deeds, termed warqa, that everyone, including Hindu as well as Muslim Gujaratis, used to transact obligations in the Western Indian Ocean. These intersecting contractual forms then lend themselves to a comparative analysis. As a specifically linguistic and social concept, I find Creolite a compelling tool for comprehending this intercommunal and intervernacular trading world. The term emerged from a specifically new world context, but more recent scholarship has explored its broader relationships to processes of cultural translation and sociolinguistic agility. So Indian Ocean East Africa was a social space of multi-directional translations, adaptations, and innovations. Gujarati intersected with Arabic and Swahili, as well as several European languages, in ways that expanded the circulation of Gujarati documents beyond the boundaries of a linguistic community. At the same time, such Creole lexicons and grammars both illuminate and were produced by broader Creole social practices that are obscured in much of the existing scholarship on Western Indian Ocean and East Africa. Jairam's observations and imagined conversations are our first clue into this Creole world. Reading his account against the grain, we get some insights as to who these African women were and the kinds of relationships that they established with Gujarati traders. Jairam writes that having taken the permission of their masters or parents or masters, African women willingly live in Batia's homes, and that if anyone does not keep an African woman, then the local Africans are astonished and make fun of them, calling them impotent, cowards, or eunuchs. In the same passage, Jairam imagines an established trader's advice to a newcomer, explaining that if you do not keep women here, then your days will not pass in happiness. Without African women, your shops would not run properly. There is a notable slippage in this passage in the meaning of the term habsan. Jairam is clearly using the term to refer to African women, both enslaved and free. Elsewhere, when he accounts the cost of keeping such women, he includes a salary, clothing and grain, a house in which to stay, and a servant to do work for her. But if these provisions do not necessarily preclude a woman's enslaved status in the East African context, an obscure reference to in the passage to the Habsan as Goli, a colloquialism for female slave, which I've only seen in Gujarati documents found in East Africa, and in this, suggests the practice and persuasiveness of forms of bondage. pervasiveness, sorry. The fact that Jairam does not use the Gujarati term for concubine, rakat, but does employ a verbal conjugation with the same root, rakna, to refer to the practice is telling. It suggests the movable boundaries between free associations and bonded ones, as well as between the rights and obligations of concubines and those of slaves. Certainly, these women were valued for both their intimate and economic labor, as well as many women as slaves, concubines, and wives were in other East African households. This point is made clearer in another reimagined exchange, in which Jairam asks the reason for the crisis or tragedy of brothers keeping Habsan. In answering, his interlocutor lists 3 benefits of keeping African women. The first, the company they provide while trading in remote locations. The second, the protection they afford from thieves. And the third, their use, quote, as a woman and eventually as a useful tool in business. Elsewhere, when lamenting the extravagant affection that Batias have for their mixed or Besa children, Jairam notes that they, quote, worked excessively hard to teach their sons the Gujarati script and miscellaneous accounting because they know that when they come of age, they will be, again, a useful tool in business. It should be clear from these exchanges, though it is often forgotten, that small household businesses that lined the Indian Ocean and East Africa would simply not have survived without the labor of local men and women here and in many different parts of the early modern world. And I'm reminded of that in this study of the Geniza documents from medieval Cairo, S.D. Goitin rather casually notes in a footnote that, quote, there can be no doubt that the romantic aspects contributed to the success of the Indian trade. And he's talking about largely North African Jewish merchants who were trading with India. Using a micro-historical approach in a sort of slightly different vein, Thomas McDowell has shown how cultivating diverse kinship ties, natal, affinal, and associative, was vital for the success of both Arabian Omani merchants and manumitted traders establishing themselves along the trade routes in the East African interior. McDowell's work is tied into a broader African scholarship on wealth and people and investment in multiple networks of association, which offers an alternative, if not unproblematic, framing of the diverse portfolios of relationships that Gujaratis maintained across the boundaries of caste, kinship, and faith. If Jairam's account exposes merchants' reliance on women's economic, intimate, and symbolic labor, then the Gujarati deeds hint at how these African women were able to use their associations with Gujarati merchants to survive and thrive in the commercial economy of Indian Ocean East Africa. And I should note that before the late 19th century, these Gujarati households seem to have easily assimilated non-Gujarati women and their children. And so beyond Jairam's account and mentions of African concubines and Afro-Gujaratis in the consulate legal records, Africans in these Gujarati documents are hard to trace. They have this sort of fragmentary existence. The figure, that was from the last one, okay. The figure who emerges most clearly is that of Fatima, whose story I must confess to being a little obsessed with, as my colleagues might be able to attest to. I first encountered Fatima in this Gujarati will, and though the document has some unusual features and phrases, I assumed it was no different from the many hundreds of wills registered in Zanzibar by Gujarati women in the 19th century. Only later did I connect it to a consular probate case in which Fatima is described as a manumitted Surya, a Swahili term for concubine, who became the wife of her former master, a Gujarati Khoja Ismaili Muslim. Returning to the will then, I could see the story of her conversion to Ismaili Islam and thus of becoming a Khoja Gujarati, her savvy financial dealings and her accumulation of capital, and her desire to determine the afterlife of that capital, financial, symbolic, and spiritual. And I want to emphasize that I would not have actually discovered Fatima's full story and the handful of others that I'm beginning to work with if I had not already begun to challenge the immutability of Gujaratiness. Despite their limited archival presence, it was the participation in this commercial world of actors like Fatima, as well as the unnamed Habsan of Jairam's account, that helped to produce the Creole nature of Indian Ocean contractual vernaculars. So contracts registered in Zanzibar, for example, inscribed core Creole concepts, such as those pertaining to time and space. Gujarati settlement deeds often stipulated that repayments be made in Damani and Mosam. Both of these terms are borrowed or adapted from Swahili terminology for the annual monsoons. The former indicates the end of the southern monsoon. The latter is a version of Msimu, meaning the end of the northern monsoon. Similarly, Arabic deeds, which you can see an example of a warqa up here on the left. So Arabic deeds contracted in East Africa adapted the Swahili term for South Kusini into Kusana, which is also an Arabic term, but it's less common. It's very common. It is the standard term in these documents, as part of clauses that located property within local Indian Ocean social landscapes. Thus, a person's property was defined by her neighbors to the west, south, north, and east. In turn, Gujarati mortgage, sale, and gift deeds that circulated within this contractual world increasingly echoed this warqa language of location. As Gujarati and Arabic deeds increasingly mirrored each other in form, they also shared understandings of value. Credit instruments, both Gujarati and Arabic, relied on distinctions between different kinds of property rights. On the Arabic side, Fahad Bishara has shown that the negotiability of the ubiquitous baikiar, or redeemable time sale, was built upon an ontological distinction between the land and its yield, while the latter could not be sold separately without potentially amounting to interest, which was prohibited by Islamic law. A sale of land necessarily included a sale of its produce. And thus, by selling their property, even when it was not fully alienable, debtors transferred a variety of rights, understood as the property's yield, from which creditors could profit. This was particularly useful for enslaved and manumitted actors who could raise capital using property that they accessed through, though did not own, their association with their masters. Gujarati creditors would have been familiar with this distinction, as much of the agricultural land in Kutch and Kathiawar had limited alienability. Creditors and debtors used a variety of, quote, enjoyment mortgages, or bo garanu, to transact various usufructuary rights. These distinguishable rights translated into two types of secured loan in East Africa, one for contracting property as alienable collateral, and another for contracting enjoyment rights, both of which came to parallel the grammars and uses of Arabic redeemable sales and pledges. I'm moving through this quite quickly, but if anyone wants to know the sort of details of those kinds of mirrorings, I can talk about them in questions. By illuminating these commensurabilities, however, I am not denying incommensurabilities in translation, meaning, and expectation. Just as the slippages between slave, concubine, and wife were important, the spaces between different translations of a transaction allowed for the negotiation of value by different parties in different contexts. To reap the full benefits of this world, then, one had to be both fluent in its Creole vernaculars and able to be agile in employing them. So where does this narrative of Creole commerce leave us on the issue of brokerage, ostensibly the historiographical adversary in my narrative? So brokerage is not a bad term. It has many uses, of course, but as Francesca Trivoletto notes, it is a rather fuzzy one. We have to ask who is brokering what and how. As a commission agent or a Brahmini in Swahili Gujarati, Jairam was one type of broker, functioning alongside many others, variously termed dalal or vakil in both Gujarati and Arabic sources. The scribes that produced and copied these deeds must be seen as another kind of broker, though one I have been unable to address in this paper. And then we also have to take Francois' point about about states being also brokers. The Sultanate of Zanzibar can also be sort of described as a kind of broker state in that way, particularly if we understand it as a kind of network of not just the sort of the Sultan and his administrators, but also the Gujarati merchants, in fact, that ran his custom house, and also the network of legal employees, so qadis, particularly judges who sort of maintained commercial law in parts of the Sultanate. Okay. But in what ways were Fatima and Jairam's unnamed women also brokers? What functions and processes do we miss if our unit of analysis remains the trading fraternity? Cross-cultural exchange is just a lot more intimate and sticky than that concept allows for, and in fundamental ways rather than peripheral ones. Ultimately, then, this paper might be another iteration of an argument that I've been making for at least a decade, that cross-cultural exchange is not comprehensible without employing gender as a category of analysis. In so doing, we can both uncover the broader cast of characters that participated in and produced exchange across the Western Indian Ocean, and the modern processes by which such intimacies have been silenced. Thank you.